Prince Louis is clearly a delightful character. He's full of energy, he's full of beans. It's an incredible thing to witness, and I think, you know, as far as the royal family are concerned, they adore him. They think he brings a lot of fun and a lot of charm to anything that he turns up.
In an unbelievable royal moment that's now making headlines worldwide, Princess Catherine found herself publicly mocked by a teacher during a casual school visit, right in front of Prince Louis. What began as a light-hearted exchange quickly turned awkward as the teacher's remark crossed a shocking line. But no one expected Louis's reaction, a response so powerful, so unexpected, that it left the entire room in stunned silence. So, what exactly did the young prince say? Grab your seat, and let's find out. Preparation for school. Sunlight streamed across the breakfast table, glinting off half-finished cereal bowls and the playful mess only a 6-year-old could create. Prince Louis sat, swinging his legs, humming a tune he'd learned in class, his laughter bouncing through the room like music. Catherine smiled, though her gaze lingered on her phone, an unread email from the school. The subject line mentioned staff update, Miss Clara, the new teacher taking over Louis's class. A few parents had quietly described her as strict but fair, the kind who valued order over charm. Catherine respected that, though a small unease tugged at her thoughts. Louis, oblivious to the adult subtext, asked if he could pack an extra snack for his friend Oliver. "Of course," Catherine replied, placing it neatly beside his lunchbox. He grinned, showing the gap where a tooth had recently fallen out. A reminder that he was still very much a child navigating a world that often treated him as more than one. By the time they left Kensington Palace, the morning routine felt perfect. Coat zipped, tie slightly crooked, chatter filling the car. Catherine's mind, however, returned to that email. Teachers were human, she knew, and working with a royal student came with invisible expectations. As the car turned onto the familiar school road, the buzz of playground laughter met them. Yet beneath that cheerful sound, something felt different today. A subtle stillness, as if the day itself was waiting to reveal something unexpected. But what was the day waiting to unfold? Stay tuned. Arriving at school. The school courtyard buzzed with morning energy, children running toward their friends, parents waving quick goodbyes, and teachers juggling clipboards with the calm precision of practiced chaos. Everything looked ordinary. Yet, when Catherine stepped out of the car with Louis, there was a pause, that brief, unspoken hush that always seemed to follow a royal arrival. Catherine, ever composed, bent to straighten Louis's collar and whispered something that made him laugh before walking him toward the entrance. Miss Clara stood near the doorway, holding a stack of papers close to her chest. She was polite, even gracious, but there was a stiffness to her smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Catherine noticed, but brushed it off as first-day nerves. After all, working with royal children could make anyone self-conscious. Miss Clara had only transferred to the school a week earlier, replacing a beloved teacher who had gone on maternity leave. Rumors among parents described her as no-nonsense, precise, and a little hard to read. As Louis greeted his classmates, Catherine exchanged pleasantries with staff, thanking them for helping him adjust so quickly to the new term. Miss Clara joined the conversation halfway through, her voice clipped and formal. "We treat every pupil the same here," she said, her tone calm but defensive, as if answering a question that hadn't been asked. Catherine simply nodded, sensing that a wall had gone up between courtesy and something colder. When she finally said goodbye to Louis and turned to leave, Miss Clara's eyes lingered, sharp, evaluating, almost calculating. It was only a moment, easily dismissed, yet it carried an edge that Catherine couldn't quite define. That subtle tension would soon shift from quiet awkwardness into something much harder to ignore. But what hidden storm was about to break? Keep watching. Miss Clara draws her line. The morning lesson began with laughter. that innocent bubbling kind that fills a classroom when children are still settling into their day. Louis sat at his small wooden desk near the front, his pencils neatly lined up, just as his mother had shown him. Miss Clara moved briskly between tables, calling names, checking homework, and setting out the first activity of the day. Everything seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. When Louis dropped his ruler, bending quickly to pick it up, another student teased, "Careful, Your Royal Highness!" The class giggled harmlessly at first. Miss Clara smiled thinly, but instead of diffusing the moment, she added, "Yes, even royal manners don't exempt one from classroom rules." Her tone was meant to sound playful, yet the edge in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't teasing, it was correction wrapped in irony. The laughter around Louis grew, light but sharp, and within seconds, the cheerful atmosphere shifted into something uncomfortable. Louis froze, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. His small hands fidgeted with his pencil. Catherine, who had stayed just a few minutes longer to help settle him, looked up sharply. Her polite expression faltered, though she said nothing. Miss Clara, realizing her words had landed too heavily, straightened a stack of books and quickly changed the subject. But the moment lingered. Children are quick to sense tension. The smiles in the room faded, replaced by quiet confusion. Louis's face flushed pink, his confidence shrinking behind his polite nod. Catherine gave him an encouraging smile, but her heart sank. She knew that tone, the one that masked discomfort with condescension. Miss Clara avoided eye contact, focusing on her papers, her jaw tightening as though to remind herself that she'd only spoken the truth. Yet inside, something churned, a mix of regret and defensiveness. She hadn't meant to humiliate the boy. She'd only wanted to set boundaries. Still, the damage was done. The laughter had died, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than any lesson could fill. But what had truly changed in that room? Stay tuned. An awkward moment. Louis sat hunched over his worksheet, his crayon gliding across the paper in small, uncertain strokes. The lively chatter that usually filled the classroom had thinned into whispers, and even the scratching of pencils seemed softer now. Children may not always understand adult tension, but they feel it, and Louis felt it deeply. He didn't know why Miss Clara's voice had sounded so sharp earlier, or why some of his classmates kept sneaking glances at him before quickly looking away. Something about the room just felt heavier. Miss Clara moved around the tables, her steps deliberate, her expression unreadable. She corrected a student's spelling, adjusted a chair, and handed out art supplies with a smile that never reached her eyes. Each time she passed Louis's desk, his small shoulders stiffened. He wanted to ask if he'd done something wrong, but his voice wouldn't come. So instead, he drew, slowly, quietly, as though each line might help him understand what had changed. Through the glass panel in the corridor, Catherine watched. She'd intended to slip away after drop-off, but something in her son's posture held her there. The tilt of his head, the hesitance in his movements. Mothers don't need explanations. They read emotion the way others read print. Catherine recognized the fragile silence of a child trying to be brave. She exhaled softly, her hand tightening around the strap of her handbag. Part of her wanted to walk in, to say something, to reset the mood. But she also knew that children needed space to find their footing. So, she stayed by the window a moment longer, watching Louis concentrate on his drawing. A stick-figure family holding hands under a bright yellow sun, before finally turning away. She'd act later, but not yet. But what had she really witnessed in that brief silence? Stay tuned. A moment of composure. Catherine stood in the school corridor, her gaze still fixed on the classroom door when her phone vibrated softly in her bag. The familiar tone cut through her thoughts like a lifeline. She stepped aside, glancing once more through the glass before answering. It was a call from her assistant at the palace office, confirming a meeting later that afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, grounding, a small reminder of the steady rhythm beyond this unsettling morning. As she listened, Catherine's breathing steadied. The conversation drifted between logistics and brief updates, yet it gave her exactly what she needed, a moment to gather herself. The irritation that had begun to bloom in her chest eased into reflection. She replayed Miss Clara's words in her mind, the tone of them, the ripple they caused. Was it intentional? Or simply a poor attempt at humor from a teacher struggling under invisible pressure? Catherine knew how easily people misstep when under the weight of public expectation. Perhaps this wasn't about malice, but nerves. When the call ended, she didn't move right away. The faint sounds of laughter and shuffling from the classroom reminded her that life inside that room, Louis's life, had to stay normal. She couldn't let her own discomfort disrupt it. After a brief moment of composure, she slipped her phone back into her bag and peeked once more through the window. Louis was back in his seat, now working with other children in small groups. Miss Clara, standing near the whiteboard, guided them with firm instructions, her earlier stiffness masked beneath a professional calm. Catherine watched for another minute, silent, thoughtful, then turned down the hall, her expression serene. She had decided she would observe before acting. Louis shines despite all odds. Paint splattered, crayons rolled off tables, and the faint smell of glue filled the air as Miss Clara announced the morning's art activity. The classroom buzzed again, the earlier tension softening beneath the hum of excitement. Sheets of paper were handed out, brushes dipped in jars of water, and giggles replaced the uneasy silence that had hovered just an hour earlier. Louis, sitting beside a classmate named Oliver, listened intently as Miss Clara explained that they would each paint something that made them feel happy. While some children immediately began drawing castles and dragons, Louis hesitated. He glanced toward Miss Clara, uncertain whether she still felt cross with him. When she caught his eye, she offered a brief nod, polite, if not warm, and moved on. Louis dipped his brush into a mix of blue and yellow, creating an uneven green, then painted a small garden scene. Beside him, Oliver's jar tipped over, spilling murky water across the table. The other children groaned, but Louis quickly grabbed tissues and began wiping it up before Miss Clara even reached their desk. "It's okay," he whispered to his friend. "We can fix it." That simple act caught Miss Clara off guard. She paused, watching the boy who had been the center of awkward laughter earlier now, quietly comforting someone else. For the first time that morning, her stern composure faltered. She knelt beside them, helping mop the spill, but her expression softened. "Thank you, Louis," she said quietly, almost apologetically. The rest of the activity went smoothly. Laughter returned, brushes danced across paper, and Miss Clara found herself smiling genuinely for the first time that day. When class ended, Louis proudly showed her his finished painting. A bright garden under a shining sun. That evening, Catherine tucked the same painting into her handbag after Louis showed it to her. Yet the joy in his voice couldn't hide the earlier unease she'd sensed. Later that night, when the house fell quiet, she made up her mind. It was time to call the headmaster. But could this quiet decision change everything? Watch closely to find out. Catherine calls. The headmaster. Catherine sat at her desk that evening, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the half-finished painting Louis had proudly brought home. The cheerful colors on the paper clashed with the unease that lingered in her thoughts. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was unsettled. This wasn't about a teacher's tone or a public slip. It was about the quiet discomfort that had shadowed her son all day. After a moment of reflection, she reached for her phone and dialed the school. The headmaster answered within moments, his voice warm but cautious, as though already aware that something was amiss. Catherine's tone was steady, respectful, but unmistakably firm. She didn't mention the royal connection or Miss Clara's remark directly. Instead, she framed her concern around principle. "Children thrive when they feel safe," she said softly. Louis felt embarrassed today, and I believe that's something we need to address constructively. The headmaster listened without interruption. He knew Catherine's reputation, never confrontational, but always clear. When she finished, he promised to handle the matter with sensitivity and confidentiality. "We'll speak with Miss Clara privately," he assured her. "I want Louis to continue feeling comfortable here." Catherine thanked him, her calmness concealing the swirl of maternal instinct beneath. She didn't want an apology made for show. She wanted awareness. Her approach wasn't about authority. It was about setting an example for her son, teaching him that fairness doesn't require shouting. After hanging up, she leaned back, exhaling slowly. It was done, neatly, professionally, and without spectacle. The next morning, when the headmaster discreetly called Miss Clara into his office, his words were measured. He didn't reprimand her, but his tone carried weight. Miss Clara nodded politely, though her eyes tightened. The sting of quiet correction left her defensive, not yet remorseful. A mother's resolve. That night after dinner, Catherine sat beside Louis on his bed as he lined up his toy cars across the blanket. The day's events had faded into the background, but a quiet uncertainty still lingered in his small voice. He wasn't sulking, just unusually quiet, careful with his words, as though trying not to say something that might upset her. Catherine sensed it immediately. "Louis," she began softly, "you know everyone makes mistakes, even grown-ups." He nodded without looking up, still rolling one of his toy cars back and forth. "What matters," she continued, "is how we respond when something makes us feel uncomfortable. No child should ever feel embarrassed for being themselves, no matter where they come from or who they are." He stopped, eyes lifting to hers, and she saw the glimmer of emotion he'd tried to hide. She reached out, brushing his hair from his forehead. "It's okay to feel hurt," she told him, "but we don't have to be angry to be strong." Those words settled over the room, gentle and firm at once, a lesson she hoped would guide him long after this small incident was forgotten. Elsewhere that same night, Miss Clara sat alone at her kitchen table, replaying the day in her mind. The laughter, her remark, the look on the Duchess's face, it all returned in sharp fragments. Her stomach tightened with guilt, though pride held her back from admitting it aloud. She hadn't meant to wound anyone, she'd only wanted to assert fairness. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how easily fairness can turn into judgment. Back in Louis's room, Catherine leaned in to kiss his forehead. "You're brave, you know that?" she whispered. He smiled faintly before asking, almost hesitantly, "Mummy, do you think Miss Clara doesn't like me?" But what happens when a prince, Louis's quiet doubt, begins to echo louder than the adult who caused it? Stay tuned. It's about to unfold. "Do you think Miss Clara doesn't like me?" Louis's question landed softly but carried the kind of weight that made Catherine's heart tighten. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, eyes wide and searching, his tone unsure. "Do you think Miss Clara doesn't like me?" he asked, almost whispering, as though afraid that saying it too loudly would make it true. Catherine paused, her hand still resting on his blanket, and felt a pang of sadness. Children didn't often speak in such direct, vulnerable ways unless something had truly unsettled them. She took a slow breath before answering. "Sweetheart, I think sometimes people say things they don't mean the way they sound. Miss Clara is still learning about you. And you're still learning about her." Louis frowned a little, processing that answer, then nodded, though his lips quivered slightly. Catherine continued, her voice calm and even. "When someone treats us unkindly, we can still choose to be gentle. That doesn't mean we let them hurt us, but we can show them who we are by how we behave." Louis leaned into her, and she wrapped her arm around him. "So we're not angry with her?" he asked quietly. "No," Catherine replied, stroking his hair. "We're not angry, but we'll make sure she understands how special you are, without ever making her feel small." That reassurance settled him. He yawned, his tiny body relaxing against hers, and within minutes, he drifted to sleep. Catherine stayed a while longer, her thoughts circling the quiet resilience of her son. When she finally stepped out of his room, she found William waiting in the hallway. He had overheard enough. The question, the tremor in Louis's voice, the tenderness in Catherine's response. Without a word, he reached for her hand. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone low but resolute. Miss Clara's hidden struggles. Miss Clara sat at her desk long after the last child had gone home, her classroom unusually still. The colored pencils and paper scraps scattered across the tables felt like quiet reminders of a day she wanted to forget. She had replayed that moment over and over, her own words echoing in her mind, sharper now than they had sounded aloud. It wasn't malice, she told herself. It had been frustration, exhaustion, the strain of expectations pressing from all sides. She was new to the school, still finding her rhythm. The parents were watchful, the standards high, and the whispers about the royal student had begun long before Louis ever sat in her class. Everyone expected perfection, and she was terrified of making mistakes, which only made her tone harder, her guard higher. The truth was she liked Louis. He was curious, gentle, and eager to please. But that very innocence reminded her of her own inadequacy, the constant fear of not being enough. The joke she'd made was a misstep born from insecurity, not cruelty. When the headmaster later reviewed the situation, he noticed it too. The weary eyes behind her forced professionalism. His tone, when he finally called her in, softened. But could compassion, not criticism, be what changes everything next? Stay tuned to see what unfolds behind closed doors. The headmaster's tone softened. The headmaster's office door closed softly behind Miss Clara as she stepped inside, her posture tense, eyes fixed on the framed certificates lining the wall. She expected reprimand, a formal warning, perhaps even the kind of conversation that ends a career before it begins. Instead, the headmaster gestured for her to sit, his tone measured, kind, almost disarming. "Miss Clara," he began, "I think we both know this week hasn't gone as smoothly as anyone hoped." She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she murmured. "It was a poor choice of words." The admission came out small but sincere. The headmaster leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than stern. "I believe you," he said. "Teaching is demanding, and working with children who carry extra attention can make even the simplest days feel heavy. But we can't allow frustration to cloud compassion. That's not who you are." His words lifted something in her, not guilt, but relief. Instead of punishment, he proposed mediation. A quiet, respectful meeting with Catherine to clear the air and restore trust. It wasn't about blame, it was about understanding. Miss Clara nodded again, her shoulders easing for the first time all week. Later that afternoon, the headmaster called Catherine to explain his plan. His tone was warm, deliberate, and reassuring. Catherine agreed almost instantly. "I don't want this to become a spectacle," she said. "We just need clarity and kindness." Yet when she mentioned it to William that evening, his brow furrowed. He understood her patience but wasn't content with assumptions. "Clarity is good," he said slowly, "but I'd prefer assurance that Louis won't feel this way again." His voice carried quiet resolve. It was clear that the next step wouldn't just be reconciliation, it would be protection. Prince William intervenes. The following morning, the headmaster received a call that caught him slightly off guard. It was from Prince William. Polite, composed, but unmistakably purposeful. He hadn't called to demand answers or issue directives, but to seek clarity. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," William began, his voice calm but firm. "I want to make sure Louis continues to feel supported, and that Miss Clara doesn't feel targeted either. This should be about growth, not punishment." The headmaster, who had been preparing for formality, found himself relaxing into the conversation. William's words carried the authority of a father, not a prince. He spoke about balance, about how children thrive when kindness guides correction, and how teachers, too, need space to learn from mistakes. There was no blame in his tone, only expectation that everyone involved would rise above defensiveness and refocus on what mattered: Louis's emotional well-being. By the end of the call, both men agreed on a path forward. The mediation would go ahead quietly, without public mention, and Louis would be shielded from any further discomfort. The headmaster assured William that Miss Clara had already shown signs of remorse and seemed ready to make things right. When Miss Clara heard that William had personally reached out, not in anger, but with measured understanding, something inside her shifted. It was one thing to be corrected by a superior, another entirely to be shown grace by someone she had unknowingly hurt. Her defensiveness began to unravel, replaced by the kind of humility that often follows being treated with unexpected kindness. That afternoon, she drafted a handwritten note, brief, careful, and sincere, asking for the chance to speak with both Catherine and Louis. It was time to set things right, not out of duty, but conscience. But how would her apology be received? With forgiveness or restraint? Stay tuned to see what happens next. The apology that changed everything. When the bell rang the next morning, the classroom hummed with the usual chatter of children settling into their seats. Miss Clara stood by her desk, her palms slightly damp, her heart steady but heavy. She had rehearsed her words all night, trying to strike the right balance between apology and sincerity. When the room quieted, she drew a slow breath and looked directly at Louis. "Before we start," she began gently, "I want to say something to all of you, especially to Louis." The children froze, curious. "Yesterday I said something that wasn't kind. I tried to be funny, but I wasn't. Teachers make mistakes too, and I'm sorry if I made anyone feel uncomfortable." Her gaze softened. "Louis, you did nothing wrong. You've been respectful and kind, and I should have been too." The silence that followed felt warm, not tense. Louis blinked, unsure how to react, but when Miss Clara smiled, he gave a small nod, forgiving in the simple, natural way only children can be. Later that afternoon, she met Catherine privately. There were no formalities, no rehearsed statements. "I truly regret how I handled that moment," Miss Clara said quietly. Louis deserved better. Catherine's reply was calm, her eyes kind. "We all learn," she said. "I'm grateful you took the time to say that." That conversation ended not with tension, but understanding. A quiet reconciliation that felt less like closure and more like the beginning of grace. Catherine's direct contact. A few days later, as the rhythm of school life returned to normal, Catherine sat at her writing desk and pulled out a small ivory card. The air around her was calm, the kind of stillness that follows a lesson learned rather than a battle won. She thought about Miss Clara, her courage to apologize, her visible remorse, and the quiet humility that had followed. Catherine didn't believe in leaving such gestures unacknowledged. She began the note simply, her handwriting neat and deliberate. "Thank you for your sincerity and professionalism. It takes courage to admit a mistake, and even greater grace to turn it into growth. Louis is happy again, and that means the world to us." Beneath those lines, she wrote a private contact number, adding, "If ever you need to speak about him, please feel free to reach out directly." It wasn't an act of protocol, but of humanity, the kind of quiet connection that builds bridges instead of walls. When Miss Clara received the card, she read it twice, then pressed it to her chest, relief and gratitude mingling in her breath. From that day, small changes rippled through the school. Teachers spoke more gently, staff introduced mindfulness sessions, and kindness became part of daily lessons. Louis moved on easily, his smile brighter, his confidence untouched. The story was never printed or announced, but quietly retold. A mother's composure, a teacher's growth, and a little boy's strength, turning discomfort into compassion. So what do you think really happened that day? Could a single remark reshape a royal classroom? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.